Hello, I'm David Sykes from PRMA Consulting. I'm joined by my colleagues Jan McKendrick and Catherine Orkerson to share our observations on using HTA learnings to drive market access strategy. Welcome to everybody. This is the second in our autumn webinar series. The first last month related to the new CDF. The last one this series will be in December after the ASH conference in mid-December. As a reference, all webinars can be downloaded from the PRMA Consulting website. Just some quick housekeeping from me before I hand over to my colleague Jan. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. Please type your questions in the lower box on the dash panel as illustrated on this slide. We will aim to answer all questions. If time does not permit, then we'll get back to each individual after the webinar. Please note that questions will only be visible to the PRMA team. I will now hand over to Jan.
Thank you, David. Today I'm going to just start with some introductions and then we're going to move through some case studies before summarising at the end. So we know manufacturers are constantly developing new medicines that can prevent disease, improve patients' health and often save lives. We see medicines transform many cancers into treatable conditions and often offer new treatment options for patients with hard to treat or rare conditions. In most cases, the changes in treatment practice are evolutionary, where we see incremental differences between new and existing treatments. However, there have been a number of more revolutionary breakthroughs leading to quick advances in the ability of drugs to provide meaningful clinical benefits to patients. There are many scientific drivers of this change, such as an increased understanding of the underlying biology, new diagnostic options, and pharmaceutical innovation itself with things such as nanomedicines. For the webinar today, we're going to focus on the three disease areas shown on the slide. In each of those, the science has evolved very quickly and we've seen rapid changes in the treatment landscape over quite short spaces of time. These disease areas will be used as a way of highlighting the key challenges to HTAs when we see rapid change. But the examples also show how it's possible to learn from these HTA assessments and use that information to plan market access strategies. Alongside the scientific motivation for rapid change, there have been various regulatory changes where effective or promising medicines can get to market quicker, which is great news for manufacturers. We can see the impact of such changes on the speed to market by comparing a few regulatory timelines for some recently launched oncology products. At least some of the medicines are getting to market quicker thanks to these regulatory initiatives. But they've also led to medicines coming to market with several indications at the same time or in very close succession, and also several medicines within the same class being approved in a short space of time. If we use the example of melanoma, we can see how quickly the treatment landscape has evolved in a relatively short space of time, with two different classes of treatments, both immuno-oncology drugs and targeted therapies, coming to the market. By the time we get to 2015, we have a very complicated treatment landscape. With that level of activity in the regulatory arena, it's perhaps not surprising that we saw a flurry of activity in the HTA world too. Even just focusing on two different drugs used as monotherapies and in a short space of time, we can see just how many assessments have been conducted by different HTA agencies. Amongst the assessments, we've definitely seen some positives and some successes, but we see that HTA approvals are not all completely aligned with the regulatory labels. We can see examples where treatments are being rejected outright or being approved in subgroups of the patient population covered by the label. But not only are we seeing new drugs come to market that are changing the treatment landscape, it's also that drugs are being used in new and constantly changing combinations and sequences. This nice example from Roche outlines their own potential for drug combinations. We see a real explosion of possibilities, and who knows what that will look like in the future as the science continues to evolve. But to balance this, payers are increasingly becoming discerning, especially when they've got several alternative treatment options to look at. They immediately look to stratify the patient population, perhaps according to biomarkers or other clinical factors, or they look to have a direct impact on the price. What we can see and what we'll explore through the case studies is a roll-up of the memory from previous HTA assessments. And we can start to then think about how that understanding of HTA assessment of the evidence package can give you valuable information for forward planning, with the ultimate goal of developing the optimal market access strategy. So as we know, HTA bodies go well beyond assessing the efficacy and safety aspects that are critical and the focus for regulators. HTAs have a framework within which to assess medicines, with a focus on the interplay between outcomes, the use of the therapy in practice, and ultimately the price. Each country's agency has specific evidence and methodological requirements and challenges, but we do know that a generalized framework of value exists across many different jurisdictions. Within this broad framework, the agencies are required to follow the methodological standards of their country and also consider broader environmental policy changes, for example, the Cancer Drugs Fund in the UK. All of the methodological approaches used by HTA are really aimed at capturing the opportunities and vulnerabilities in the data package that's presented to HTA, and then using that to support increasingly aggressive pricing and access negotiations. In the EU, we've seen market access become even more restricted in recent years, with such things as focusing on incremental therapeutic benefit against active and relevant standards of care, an increasing use of cost effectiveness as a formal requirement, and the use of quality of life data, not only to look at survival, but the quality of that survival, and to contextualize the adverse event profile. Not only do we see these challenges at a national level, but also often at regional and local levels too. So to maximize the market access opportunity, manufacturers must demonstrate the product value in payer-relevant terms while addressing some of these key issues you can see, which are very, very relevant to payers. We already know that payers are faced with difficult decisions, and in a rapid changing treatment environment, this adds an awful lot of complexity. We often see payers and HTAs express concerns and criticisms of the evidence they're assessing, and many of those make their way to the public domain. Websites can be a very useful thing. When we think about this in the context of the rapidly evolving landscape, there are some particular issues which are particularly challenging. Manufacturers are coming to HTA often with much more limited data packages that might be based on phase 2 single-arm studies or maybe limited phase 2 or 3 data. Although that might be sufficient to demonstrate efficacy to regulators, it may not be as comprehensive, comparative or extensive as HTA bodies would like to see when they're assessing comparative effectiveness. It's also possible that there are several medicines approved within a class in a short space of time, and it might be very hard to distinguish one from another in terms of a strong comparative evidence base. Traditional outcomes measures may not be sufficient for that differentiation and may not capture the true value of a new product. Within a rapidly changing environment, the choice of clinical and economic comparator is often not clear. Clinical guidelines struggle to keep up with the rate of change, and that gives no reference point for HTAs. And with all of these different things, payers are really being asked to make decisions almost in real time, accommodating all the differences between the evidence package of different drugs. These are just some examples of where payers see uncertainty around the value of a product and then see the opportunity to dilute the value proposition of a new drug. And that in turn leads to suboptimal pricing outcomes for manufacturers. To manage that uncertainty, the payers are using mechanisms that are available to them in their jurisdiction. That may be restrictions on the position in the treatment pathway and or on the patient population, or it may be a restriction in terms of price, be that the price itself or some kind of price volume restriction. So understanding how the agencies view uncertainty and trying to anticipate their approach to the assessment of drugs, and then looking for ways to influence that assessment becomes vital in securing optimal market access outcomes. There are clearly many issues we could talk about around this, but today we're going to focus on just 3 and illustrate through examples what knowledge can be gained from understanding the thought processes of HTAs. So the first example we're going to look at focuses on clinical endpoints and illustrates the evolving thinking around relevant clinical endpoints. There are many different ways this can play out in practice. We may see HTAs faced with very unfamiliar endpoints and coming to terms with how best to assess those. We may say changing expectations around short and long-term outcomes or between laboratory-based outcomes and longer-term clinical outcomes. We may also see the role of surrogate endpoints evolving over time. But for today, we're going to focus on an assessment of comparative survival outcomes using melanoma as the example. As you saw earlier, before the approval of Yervoy in 2011, there was really very little in the way of advancement for the management of patients with melanoma. Yervoy was one of the first immuno-oncology agents to be assessed, and lots of issues were arising for the first time during these HTA assessments. This slide shows some of the challenges faced by NICE in their first review of Yervoy in second-line treatment. We've used NICE as a specific example primarily because they often lead the way in terms of the methodology they use to conduct assessments. So from the very beginning, there was a recognition that the shape of the survival curves with the IO drugs was very different than that with standard chemotherapy. There appeared to be what's called a tail effect, where the survival distribution flattened out. If that flattening was to be sustained, then assessing where the tail started and then estimating the long-term survival were absolutely critical to understanding the true value of a treatment. The added complication then became how to estimate relative effects, especially as new treatment classes were added into the mix and different profiles of responses for the drugs had to be considered. What we can see here is that over time, the methodological approach to modelling survival has evolved substantially, but along with that, so has the complexity of dealing with treatment comparisons. But not only are we watching a two-dimensional evolution, but we're also seeing NICE experiment and refine their thinking, as you can see on the bottom of this slide. So we've only picked a few examples of submissions to illustrate our point. But in the first submission was the first one of Yervoy, the first immuno-oncology agent conducted by NICE. And we see already this recognition of the tail effect and the disease kinetics and how that would be important. We saw a recognition that modelling survival was a complex issue, but we also saw NICE undertaking a whole range of survival analyses as part of their assessment. They decided those analyses were inconclusive, but they really provided exceptionally valuable insight into the issues that they felt were going to be important for this class of drugs. By the time of the next submission we've looked at here, so that's Yervoy in first-line treatment, that was about 18 months later. And what we saw then was the manufacturers trying to address some of the concerns and criticisms that had been levelled at the first attempts with the assessments. The survival modelling was much more complex and with a real recognition that one size did not fit all for comparative purposes. We also saw indirect treatment comparisons for the first time because the treatment landscape had become that much more complex. So by this stage, NICE were really thoroughly and critically reviewing all assumptions around indirect comparisons and expressing issues such as exchangeability of patient populations across trials. Again, they're beginning to, through their actions and their concerns and criticism, give a real insight into how they're dealing with the complexity facing them. So the third example we have then is one from just earlier this year, where Opdivo and Yervoy were assessed in combination. At this point, the modelling approach for survival was really very complicated, adjusting now for patient and trial characteristics as well as understanding differences in response profiles of the drugs. But we also saw nested models, semi-Markov approaches, so some fairly complex survival modelling. But the nature of the comparative data came under even more scrutiny at this time. And it wasn't just in terms of the input values that the scrutiny was laid, but more in terms of how the nature of the synthesis of the data influenced the model outcomes. So the level of scrutiny that was placed on the assessments at this time was far, far greater, even though manufacturers had been learning with NICE. I think one important other point to make here is, in the final one of our examples here, NICE returned to the idea of modelling more than one line of therapy. That had been an idea that had been dismissed 2 years earlier, but it really shows how NICE think that some of the challenges had already been overcome and returned to the issue that they knew was appropriate but couldn't quite address. So certainly through this example, I think we can show really how keeping up to date with the evolving thinking of the HTA bodies and trying to anticipate their next move can be absolutely critical for a new entrant to a marketplace. A few key points here then which can help manufacturers refine their market access strategy. Extrapolation of survival curves and what that means has become a real issue for NICE and other agencies. Not only do we see them increase their complexity of modelling, but we also see them becoming attuned to what manufacturers wish to achieve and develop strategies to blunt it, which manufacturers really do need to be aware of. The estimates of long-term survival were said by NICE to be required in the context of the natural history of the disease. But as we saw, that natural history was evolving with the emergence of these new treatments. So particular attention had to be paid to plausibility of estimates. And NICE were really looking for manufacturers to go that extra mile to convince them that their assumptions were correct. We saw a much, much more complex and sophisticated approach to indirect treatment comparisons. They had to deal not only with different shaped survival curves, but different patient populations across trials. It became very challenging, but it also became clear that this was the expectation of NICE, that manufacturers had to find a way to deal with it. So across this example then, we see payers having opportunities to dilute the value, but manufacturers can take steps to mitigate the impact. And I would just finish by saying melanoma has been a really big learning ground for payers who will apply these learnings to other indications such as myeloma, renal cell carcinoma, and non-small cell lung cancer already in progress, but also to subsequent indications or subsequent resubmissions of the drugs. The second example illustrates how payers deal with situations where the place in the treatment pathway for a new product is not clear. The example we're going to use here is from CLL. To ensure appropriate use of new treatments, payers always wish to clearly identify the place in therapy in order that they can support the choice of clinical or economic comparator. In CLL, what we saw over time was an increasingly segmented patient population, where additional subgroups needed to be considered for each product. This was primarily based on the regulatory labels feeding into HTA, But we did also see HTAs adding their own layers of complexity, such as whether or not patients were suitable for chemotherapy. Selecting the correct comparator for clinical trials can be challenging anyway, but the rapid pace of change in the environment, like CLL, and the increasingly segmented treatment landscape, patient subgroups, led to issues around comparators at the HTA assessment. We're going to use Zidelig as a case study where the regulators agreed to an indication which was supported from evidence only from a small number of patients from the key clinical trials. Although the manufacturer only filed for an indication in the relapsed refractory patients, the EMA considered that the benefit seen in the relapsed patients was likely to be seen also in the untreated setting, despite there being an evidence base of 9 patients to support this. As a result, when it came to HTA, there was not a wealth of evidence to support the treatment in first line, and the evidence there was came from a non-comparative study. Combined with that, the comparator used in the relapsed refractory setting was not approved as a monotherapy for CLL. For Imbruvica, another drug for CLL, there were similar issues with the regulatory indication, but this time the trial comparator was Azera, an earlier approved drug for CLL. However, it turned out not to be widely used in the relapsed refractory setting, making it not a very good comparator. So as a result, there were really fragmented assessments at HTA. So using Zidelig as our example, we see the single regulatory approval can lead to really different patient groups being approved at the HTA level. And we can really see what this means to payers by looking at the GBA assessments of both drugs, both Zidelig and Imbruvica. What you can see then is the really fragmented patient group, the comparator changing with that patient group, and as we know, a lack of evidence to support comparators and outcomes in many of the subgroups. So what we saw then was the benefit assessment had very different outcomes for different patients and subgroups of patients with CLL. So the rapid rate of change can make identifying the place in therapy and the associated comparator treatment really challenging. So it's really critical to understand how the HTAs approach this and look for ways to evolve the evidence base to justify the comparator selection, support the subgroup strategy, all designed to optimize the market access of the drug. The third example is around patient groups and subgroups. We know that payers require clarity on the target patient population, and focusing on patient subgroups is a strategy HTA agencies can use where they see increased value in specific groups of patients. However, it's also a strategy they use where they wish to limit the financial exposure to a new drug. I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, who will talk you through an example in HCV.
Thanks, Jan. As Jan says, for this example, we will be focusing on hepatitis C. The hepatitis C landscape has become very high profile since late 2013, driven by several factors such as the potential for cure, large patient populations, and the high cost of new treatments. Up until 2011, there were only 2 direct-acting antivirals, and only genotype 1 of the 6 genotypes was covered. However, between early 2014 and early 2015, 5 new DAAs were approved by the EMA, covering all genotypes of HCV. The label language for these new DAAs is general, but there is complexity in how the EPA considered the patient populations. For example, different backbone products and treatment durations were recommended for certain subpopulations. An analysis of the trials submitted by the manufacturer also provided subpopulation data. Therefore, although the label language is broad, there are factors within the EPAs which give the potential for subdivisions of the patient population. This can be seen in the ways that HTA agencies approach these drugs. Taking Germany as example, Initially, when the GBA assessed the first wave DAAs, for example Victrelis in 2012, they based their subgroups on genotype and treatment history. However, by 2014 the perspective was different. There was many patients potentially eligible for high-cost treatment with the new DAAs across these genotypes, and payers wished to control budgets and limit use to those with the highest unmet need. The GBA saw the way that despite the broad label language, these regulatory agencies had shown data which subdivided the populations and used this as a basis for subdivisions in their HTA assessments, based on factors seen in the EPAs such as genotype, cirrhosis status, and the prior treatment status. We also need to acknowledge that as the disease area moved so fast, many HTA decisions were released into these uncertain treatment landscapes. Several HTA agencies released initial individual decisions, quickly followed by joint reassessments to reflect this changing landscape, and some of these changed the original recommendations. We can see this from the TLV in Sweden. In 2014 to 15, 5 new DAAs were assessed individually. We've taken Declinza as an example, which was limited to the F3, F4 severe fibrosis patient population in genotypes 1, 3 and 4. A group reassessment extended reimbursement to the less severe patients with fibrosis stage 2. However, this extension was only seen in genotype 3. The extension to F2 was decided because of price cuts, and also taking into account that an increasing amount of the most severely ill F3, F4 patients had already been treated. However, this joint reassessment took a different approach from a classic single-agent HTA and considered the optimal sequence of agents for each genotype individually, giving a rationale as to why only the genotype 3 population was extended. Other agencies have taken different innovative approaches to managing the high budget impact and large patient numbers in HCV. The INS in Quebec undertook a joint assessment of Harvoni and Viekira Pak in 2015. They applied population reimbursement restrictions, but prospectively, with a 6-year plan over 3 stages. The INS, when discussing their rationale, noted that although the treatment costs of these drugs are high, they were similar to that of the other DAAs that had already been reimbursed, and the INS found the cost effectiveness to be reasonable across all the populations. However, the budget impact was very high, $1 billion over 6 years, so it appears here that the financial implications drove this stepwise approach. So we can see in this example that manufacturers need to expect that payers will aggressively seek to manage their budgets by subdividing the patient population. Manufacturers can monitor and anticipate where payers see these subgroups are emerging and align their approaches to these patterns.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Jan. So as Catherine and Jan have been going through that presentation, we've had a number of questions coming through. So I'm going to open up a couple, firstly to Jan, and then I'll probably take a couple as well. So the first question, Jan, relates to, do these rapidly evolving landscapes help or hinder payers?
I think the answer to that is probably a bit of both, actually. If you think back to the melanoma example, there's a pure volume of workload issue for HTAs in the rapidly changing landscape. So just the number of appraisals they have to get through in a short space of time may cause some of them some issues. But I think on the other hand, in that short space of time, they're able to do the learning and not forget it. So I think from that perspective, I think it definitely helps. And then, yeah, so overall potentially beneficial. Anything to add?
No, I think it's beneficial. They see this as an opportunity from a renegotiation perspective, from a competitive perspective, and I think we've seen with the recent news that NICE are now going to charge for assessments, that they're cognizant of this significant workload as well. So we're going to push a lot of this back onto industry. One question which I'll summarise is, it seems impossible to pin payers down on this. So I think that's an understandable perspective. What I would say on that is I think that it's scenario dependent. So I think, if you compare a single asset with a single indication versus one asset with multiple indications, payers are going to develop different coping strategies there. But I think it's also important to recognize that with each move payers signal, precedent is set. And so that makes it very difficult for them to wriggle out of that moving forward as well. So really understanding the criticality of what you can and cannot leverage is key here. And I think that has significant implications for product value and development.
And I think if you go back to the melanoma example we presented, we saw by the second assessment of Yervoy that they were signaling it was too difficult to model sequences of drugs, but not that they didn't want to see it. So if you track and watch what they're doing, once they overcame that complexity, it wasn't surprising that they came back to wanting to model multiple lines.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think they signal, and you have to pick up on all the signals, and build them up into a picture to help you.
Yeah.
Because once they signal, they have to stand by that too.
And I think it's really important, as you say, Jan, the depth and breadth of these signals, they are very complex, they are nuanced, so being able to really pick those apart with great levels of understanding is the only way you're going to be able to start to apply some of those learnings moving forward. One of the questions relates to the convergence between regulators and payers in terms of informing these rapidly evolving landscapes, and what are the implications around that. So we've seen a lot of initiatives around joint scientific advice, etc., etc. I think it's fair to say there's been limited success with those initiatives as it stands at the minute. We've got a divergence between the regulatory pathways, which are encouraging accelerated approvals with smaller data packages, and the introduction of greater uncertainty from a payer perspective. But that uncertainty allows payers to really dilute value. So I think from our perspective, it really is a critical trade-off there between achieving regulatory approval and achieving a commercially appropriate level of price or access. And it's clear that in many organizations that's a difficult conversation to have, but I think it's absolutely critical that market access and HEOR people are leading the discussions around that to ensure that not every phase 2 single arm or expedited regulatory approval package is the panacea that perhaps the commercial medical organizations are thinking through. Jan, anything to add on to that?
I don't think so, really, no.
Yeah.
Articulated that just beautifully.
Okay, so next question is relating to uncertainty. Without going into the details, there's a question here about a lot of value was given up around the extrapolations in an oncology indication, and Jan's talked about some of the ways that NICE and other cost effectiveness archetypes are dealing with this, but also thinking about will that value ever be reclaimed? So access schemes have facilitated pricing access schemes have facilitated earlier access because of this uncertainty. When there's data provision of more mature evidence, will that ever lead to price increases? And I think people have talked about that, but I can't ever see it happening. There are some specific clauses in certain countries where certain situations would allow this, but I think the rapidity of the thinking across many of these areas now is likely to preclude that. Jan?
I think, we've presented a lot of challenges for HTAs, and I think what we haven't done is talked as much about the potential ways you can mitigate that. But I think our message really is, there's a lot to learn here, and it's worth the learn because there are things you can put in place. Payers are going to take this attitude anyway. The best you can do is be up to speed of them and think ahead of them. and it may not solve all the problems, but some of these things will take place anyway. So better to be informed and be at the party and play that game rather than to be on the back foot the whole time. At least be prepared for it.
Yeah, and I think internally as well, you're able to manage expectations across the cross-functional groups as well about those challenges and the implications from a value perspective as well. There's a question here about, it's perhaps not a question, it's more a statement that as we move towards a world of combinations in oncology, it's going to make these challenges even greater. What can be done? And I think just as you've outlined, Jan, there, it's really understanding how we're in the early stages of combinations with nivolipine, with the BRAF/MEK in melanoma, and with the myeloma examples as well. We've got a slightly older example in breast as well. But it's about understanding how those submissions and data packages and value propositions have been picked apart, what's resonated with the payers, what's not resonated with the payers, and started again to critically understand those and pull those apart. The next question relates to issues around HCV in particular and how payers have critically evaluated that. And Catherine did a very nice job of taking you through the differences in the regulatory label versus the reimbursed label. And the question again is, how do you anticipate for those kind of scenarios? And I think it's very, very tough to really pick that apart. But again, you can think very critically about your target label population, the subgroups that you are pre-specifying, precedents in previous HTAs, understanding where the biology is taking people. So there's lots of areas where you can start to think about how subgroups are going to be created by payers, but also you've got to do a very good job of work of really focusing in on the clinically plausible ones and making sure you've got a lot of evidence to support why a subgroup is not appropriate as well. So I don't think you should shy away from that fight directly with payers.
And in subgroups that you can highlight particular unmet need, that might be a strategy you think of. So I think there's lots of things you can do, but looking at the clinical literature, trying to anticipate where the science is taking it, I think that's where we started the presentation. This is about science evolving, and I think the best that you keep up with that and really look to that to guide some signals as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'm conscious we're just coming towards the end of time, so I've got some concluding remarks here. So thanks to Jan and Catherine for a great presentation. They've outlined the significant challenges we face in these rapidly evolving landscapes and the thought processes that payers have brought to the market as well, using melanoma, CLL and HCV as examples. So they've learned a significant amount in real time over a short period of time as well. The real learning playground has been melanoma, and they're starting to apply that to many different indications now. They focused in on both technical, methodological and budgetary challenges and been able to quite successfully splinter groups, populations and value across pretty much everything they look at. And they're increasingly using these mechanisms to dilute value with a view to setting up an aggressive price negotiation. So given the depth and the breadth of these payer challenges, it's critical to be able to track these landscapes comprehensively and thoroughly, and to be able to use that knowledge that you've gleaned to develop actionable insights which support optimal market access and also help inform your internal conversations and manage expectations as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who's attended. As a reminder, you can go to the PRMA Consulting website to download this webinar and our historical webinars as well. Thank you very much.